So this week we have several exciting ideas to discuss, and we'll try and get through as many of them as possible. Emor is one of the fascinating portions in the middle of the book of Leviticus, and it goes through many different things, focusing a lot on the Jewish holidays. It has a review of all the Jewish holidays in the portion of Emor. It also touches upon Shavuot, which we are approaching, as well as the counting of the Omer, which we are in the midst of observing. It also starts off with a mitzvah associated generally with the Kohanim, but is also directed to all of us, as we were saying earlier, talking about saving lives and acting selflessly on behalf of others. So the way the discussion goes is the Torah tells us about an interesting lifestyle that the Kohanim need to maintain. This is not a lifestyle of comfort. This is not a lifestyle of luxury, but a lifestyle of commitment, a lifestyle of devotion to what they represent. And the specific requirement that is discussed is the mitzvah that the Kohanim abide by, which is not to become impure and not to come in contact with a dead body. We know in Judaism, a dead body represents tum'ah, impurity. And one of the explanations for that is because life is holiness, life is synonymous with holiness, and the absence of life is synonymous with unholy. So whenever there is an absence of life, automatically there is a quality of tumah, of impurity, that automatically takes root in that situation. The Kohanim, whose whole life is devoted towards the Holy Temple, which means their whole life is devoted towards a service, a duty of connecting people to God, connecting the world with a spiritual essence, with a spiritual compass. They serve in that capacity, and therefore they have to be exposed and aligned and connected to everything that represents life, and disconnected from everything that represents the opposite of that. But the Torah gives a few exceptions. And the Torah says that a Kohen whose immediate family members pass away, they are allowed to involve themselves in the taking care of that loved one, any one of the seven primary relatives, which is mother, father, son, daughter, or wife, brother, and sister. And those are the seven relatives that a regular Kohen is allowed to make an exception and become impure by involving themselves in the funeral and in the caring of their burial. The Kohen Gadol, however, which is the high priest, who's on an even higher level, he's held to an even higher standard and is told to not even expose himself to those seven primary relatives. He is only allowed to engage in the burial of what we call a met mitzvah. A met mitzvah, met means a person who's passed, a dead body, that it is a mitzvah to bury them. Why is it a mitzvah? Because there's no one knows that they have passed. There's no one close by to take care of them, and only the Kohen Gadol has become aware of their need and is obligated, therefore, to get involved in taking care of this individual. That's quite amazing when you think about this for a moment. This situation is really a very, very insightful, gives us a very insightful understanding of what the role of a Kohen Gadol is really all about. Because, as we said, the Kohen Gadol is not allowed to involve himself in the burial of his own relatives. Yet this met mitzvah, this stranger who the Kohen Gadol has never met before, he doesn't know who they are, he just knows that there's a vulnerable human being who needs taken care of. The Kohen Gadol has to put everything else aside and involve himself in that person, that dead person's needs. Not only that, but in the process of this, the Kohen Gadol is now going to disqualify himself from entering into the Holy of Holies, from entering into the Holy Temple. Because once he does come in contact with the dead, he has to go through a cleansing process for 7 days. So what we're seeing over here is a very powerful idea. On the one hand, we are being guided to the concept that a person has to align himself with the highest levels of purity of holiness, and especially the Kohen and the Kohen Gadol have to align themselves with that kind of surroundings. On the other hand, we are told that when push comes to shove, and there's a vulnerable human being, a member of society, who needs our help, and we are the only ones positioned to assist, to help, to deliver salvation for that human being, whether they're physically dead or whether they're spiritually unresponsive, whether there's a physical threat to their lives or whether there's a spiritual threat to their lives, we have to be there for them. We have to be their Kohen Gadol. We have to be their savior and their guardian to assist them in their time of need. And this is really something that applies, of course, not only to the Kohanim and not only to the Kohen Gadol, but to every single Jew. Because the Torah is telling us this teaching for all of us to study. Even though it applies to the Kohanim in a particular way, in a more general way, it applies to all of us. And certainly, we can all function in this way for others who need our assistance, who need our help. Like you were saying earlier, of this friend of yours who has been helping people struggling with drug addiction for so many years, and that is really a meit mitzvah. These people are vulnerable. These people really need our help, and stepping up and doing what we can to help people like that in need is really what this teaching is all about. There's a beautiful story that highlights this idea and expands upon it a little bit, which is it took place in 1986. 1986 in Brooklyn, New York. There was a fellow living in Borough Park. And I don't know the exact details of the circumstances, but he had a terrible family situation that was really ripping the family apart and very, very difficult. He was at his wit's end. He didn't know what to do. And he was asking fellow people in the community, what should we do? So what should he do? And how can he get some advice, some help? So people in the community in Borough Park told him the only one that can really help you with this is the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And if you go to the Lubavitcher Rebbe, then he can give you guidance. He's the kind of person that can help you with this. So he calls up an old friend he has, a Chabadnik, a Lubavitcher fellow, and he tells him that he has this major problem. He wants to meet with the Rebbe. Could he help him arrange a yechidus, which is a private audience, with the Rebbe? And his friend tells him that the Rebbe no longer sees people in private audience. The Rebbe stopped that in the early 80s, and it wouldn't be possible. But he needed an immediate answer, and he was really desperate. So his friend told him, there's one thing I can tell you to do. Well, if you want to meet the Rebbe out of schedule, this guy told him, go to the Rebbe's house. The Rebbe leaves his house around 9:30, 10 o'clock in the morning. And sometimes when he's walking to the synagogue or someone's getting a ride, you can catch him walking out of his house and you can get a moment to talk to him. So he was so desperate, he went early the next morning, waited outside, and sure enough, around 9:30, as he was told, the Rebbe's door opens, of the door of his house, and he walks down the stairs towards the street. As he comes to the street, this fellow approaches the Rebbe and says, I have a terrible dilemma, a terrible problem. I'm hoping you can help me. And basically they have a 5 to 7 minute conversation, which is extremely unusual. But the Rebbe engaged him and accommodated his request, and they spoke for 5 to 7 minutes. After the conversation was over, the Rebbe continued on his way to the synagogue. And there were several yeshiva students who were watching this encounter. And after the Rebbe walked away, they went over to this fellow, this Borough Park Jew. They said to him, how dare you interfere with the Rebbe's schedule? How dare you stop the Rebbe on his way to synagogue and bother him with your questions? This is totally unacceptable. It's totally inappropriate. How could you? And they made him feel really, really bad. He walked away. He felt terrible. He decided to write an apology letter to the Rebbe, apologizing for approaching him like that in such a trivial, in such a unofficial manner. Within a few hours, he gets a call from the Rebbe's secretary. And he says, the Rebbe told me to respond to your letter right away. And the Rebbe told him as follows. 2 things. First of all, those yeshiva boys who told you that, they had no business being there in front of my house. They should have been in yeshiva. They should have been doing what they're supposed to do. That's number 1. Number 2, I want to tell you something that I heard in the name of the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov said that a person can come down into this world and live a full life of 70 or 80 years. And the whole reason for them coming down into this world for such a long time, 70 or 80 years, is one moment where they may genuinely help a fellow human being. Just one time. The Rebbe, in his comment and response, said, maybe this was the whole purpose for which my soul came down into this world, to have the 5-minute conversation with you this morning. This is the way the Rebbe looked at the opportunity to help another person. It wasn't just to add meaning to his life. It wasn't just to help in a case where he thought he could give some advice. He looked at it as possibly the whole purpose for him being here. This gave him a reason for looking forward to another day, because his purpose was being fulfilled by helping another human being, which is the exact message that the Torah portion is conveying to us, the exact same idea. The Kohen Gadol, he's on his way, just like the Rebbe. He's on his way to the Holy Temple. He's on his way to the synagogue. He's on his way to some very holy encounters, some very holy commitments. And what does he do? He realizes that is just the setting. That is just the backdrop. That is just the stage upon which the real connections and the real mitzvot and the real selfless acts are occurring. And this is the powerful lesson number 1 from the Torah portion.